So this next session, though, is about governments driving change. As you know, the challenge is immense. As you've heard today, we don't make this transition, to use again that critical term, transition, to a low-carbon, climate-resilient economy without strong state action. I talked at the beginning of the day about how we're beginning to see the fruit of state action in the past already in the lower costs of renewable energy. ClimateBonds talks so fantastically about, you're lunatic to think of anything else at this stage given where the revolution has got to. Well, that started off, thank you Germany, thank you China, with strong offtake agreement action. Feed-in tariff was essentially creating demand, creating offtake agreement. And that's flowing off to renewable energy, to hydrogen, and so on. Of course, electric vehicles, similar story. It grew because of strong state action. Whilst the strong state action was primarily China, that had a geopolitical reason to try and get off oil, if you like, as well as a climate change reason. Even Tesla itself was started with a $1 billion grant or loan from the federal government, which allowed it to get going in the first place. This is not what you'd call free markets. This is something which required state intervention. Now, the nature of state intervention will change. Our challenge is to look at fiscally efficient measures for state intervention. Given the balance sheet constraints, we can't afford to do quite what the UK government tried to do, although what they're trying to do is still very hard to understand. But blow money without some understanding of where it's going to come from. Clearly, we have to be responsible, even more so, because the budgets of all our governments are going to be drastically stretched by emergency funding. Think Hurricane Ian on steroids, if you like, is what the world's going to look like going forward, which means that where we can do something with private sector capital, we will need to do it with private sector capital. And that requires, essentially, a close working collaboration between the public sector and the private sector. Hey, we've still got to be rapid. That's our challenge. Today, we are launching, in draft form, for your comment, 101 ideas for public sector action towards 1.5 degrees Celsius. It's in the app, it's on our website. It's a beginning of a bigger project. And there's a whole table of ideas with detail attached. We'd like to get feedback. And this will become a long-going project. We're developing projects where people give us indications that this is a priority. Is the Global Offsets Alliance that I talked about with Tony Rook, GOA, as we like to say it, something we should concentrate on? Is it going to be how we more effectively treat guarantees, green guarantees on our balance sheets to increase our leverage ratio? There's some opportunities there. Is it about greening our development finance institutions? We have 500 development banks in the world, by the way. Very few are very green, and very few have any kind of leverage ratio, straight lending. There's opportunities there. Give us your feedback. In the meantime, though, we have a panel. On this particular panel, I have, first, if I can invite to the stage our two speakers who are in person, Marie Diron, who's Managing Director of Sovereigns and Subnational Risk at Moody's. This is credit rating for governments, folks. Remember that. Incredibly important person. See if you can get 2 seconds of her in the break afterwards. Very, very important. And then secondly, Rathin Roy, who's Managing Director of ODI, used to be called the Overseas Development Institute in a past incarnation. I can't help myself, Rathin, I'm sorry. But more recently, the Director of the National Institute of Public Finance Policy in India, and a member of, until a while ago, of Prime Minister Modi's Economic Advisory Council. And then online, we will have in a minute Martin Spolk, who's the Head of Sustainable Finance and FinTech Unit in DG FISMA, the Ministry of Finance of the European Commission, who's going to we're going to have a conversation. But just to get going, we're going to hear a recorded conversation from my friend Dr. Marjun, who's the head of chair of the Green Finance Committee in China, advisor to the governor of the People's Bank of China on green finance, and I'm going to say the doyen of green finance in China. I've been working with him now for 7 or 8 years on the revolution that's underway in China. If we can play, he's unfortunately got to be speaking at another event at this very time, so we had to record a session. If I can play that video, that'd be great. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sean, for having me. On your question, I think the government should play a pivotal role in developing the infrastructure for green finance and also providing incentives. Now, more specifically, I think the government should play four key roles. Number one, defining what is green. And in our case, China has done actually three different taxonomies for that definition. One is for green loans. That's what we did back in 2013. And second one was the green bond taxonomy, which started in 2015. We now have the second version. And the third taxonomy is on green projects, which was introduced in 2019. So we now have a system of green taxonomies, which covers most of the financial products. With that taxonomy, we are able to avoid large part of greenwashing because these are officially defined green rather than individually defined green or randomly defined green. The second key thing I think government should do is to have a disclosure requirement so that those companies raising money from the green finance market will have to report their environmental benefits, how they use the proceeds, and making sure that they are using the proceeds in the right way. We have done some of these in the past, mainly focusing on user proceeds and environmental benefits, and now we're moving the disclosure requirements towards more TCFD-like reporting requirements. So in the future, there'll be more disclosure requirements related to governance, strategy, policies, processes, and so on. The third key pillar is incentive. You need to scale up the market, and for many parts of the green activities, they're actually not making enough profits to attract private sector money, and that's why initially incentives are important. In China, namely the Central Bank of China introduced the decarbonization facility, which offers low-cost funding through the commercial banking system to green projects. And that facility is roughly 2 percentage points lower in terms of funding cost compared with the market. And also we had the local government.
2 percentage points, 2 percentage points. That's huge.
Yeah, it's 200 basis points. Not like the market talking about 5 basis points. We're talking about 200 basis points. And local governments in China are also offering additional incentives, for example, in the form of interest subsidies. In quite a few places, they offer subsidies in the range of 40 to 60 basis points, and also guarantees, which I think should be done not only within the country but also internationally through de-risking facilities offered by MDBs and so on. And the final point I'd like to make is the government role as the demonstrator for using green finance. For example, in Hong Kong, the government actually became the largest issuer of green bond. And it certainly incubated the market by promoting the usage of, for example, verification services and adoption of standards and developing capacity and so on. So after a while, then the private sector will catch up.
So it's a huge agenda, right? And we've got a long way. I mean, how fast is the super tanker of the Chinese economy turning as a result of these incentives for those people in the rest of the world watching from outside? What's your take on that?
So far, we have the largest green lending market already in the world. The outstanding amount of green loans in China is 20 trillion RMB, which is, I think, something like 3 trillion US dollar. And our green bond market is now ranking the second in terms of outstanding amount. It's about 1.4 trillion. And it took us, roughly 7-8 years to get to that level. And it's still growing very fast. Last year, our green loans were growing at 33%. And this year to date, 40% year-on-year growth. And last year's green bond issuance is 170% growth, still growing at massive pace. Largely, I think, due to the few things I just mentioned in terms of infrastructure, disclosure requirements, and incentives.
It sounds like, Majun, there's a tidal wave of change happening in green finance. While people are looking at the worries about energy, coal plants versus clean energy plants, and so on, this change is actually well and truly underway within the green economy. Have I got that right?
despite the pushback in the short term against the decarbonization in many countries, due to the energy crisis and so on, I think the momentum for green finance remains very strong, especially for medium and longer term, because every single country recognizes that the renewable energy is the safest energy in terms of availability, right? If you in the future have most of the energy coming on your land in the form of solar and wind and storage, then you don't need to import anymore. And that's actually strengthening the momentum for investment in the renewable sector.
Last question, Marjun. In the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group, what's the critical advisory for government that you're making, and how much traction are you getting?
This year, the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group is working on a couple of topics, and the main one is the transition finance framework. And I'm hopeful that in the middle of November, this piece of work will be approved by the leaders of the G20, and it should guide the international work on establishing a transition financial framework in many countries. Now, what we stated in that document, of course, in the draft form now, is that we need to have methodologies to identify transition activities so that we can avoid the transition wash. And we need to have clear disclosure requirements to report to the transition activities. And we need to have a toolbox of financial instruments, not only debt instruments, but also equity and de-risking facilities. And we need to have government incentives to make many transition projects bankable. And finally, to do something to ensure that the transition process is just.
Thank you, Dr. Marjun. I'd now like to try and see if I can get Martin to kick us off with some comments. You've heard Martin, Dr. Marjun, talk about his view of the agenda, definitions. Funnily enough, Europe's done a bit about that, as we heard in the previous panel. Disclosure. Funnily enough, Europe's done a bit about that, as I'm sure you'll tell us a bit more. Incentives, though, we're toying with without doing a lot. Demonstration, we're certainly doing. The European Green Bond Programme is a 250 billion euro plan, as I understand to do. So we're ticking some boxes. But of course, you've been the architect in your role at the DG FISMA, effectively Europe's Ministry of Finance, in drafting the Sustainable Finance Action Plan. And we've been working together for years on this now. It's been a roller coaster ride, but you cheered me up immensely recently by talking about the reinvigorated agenda, the new things coming through. I'm wondering if you can share for the audience the key tenets of that Sustainable Finance Action Plan and what's happening.
Hi, Sean. Good afternoon, everyone. It's really great to be joining your panel. First of all, I can confirm that there is a lot of things happening in Europe, and there are really a lot of great plans ahead. Maybe I should clarify what the role of policymakers in this area is. For us, I mean, the philosophy that we have been pursuing is that we as policymakers and regulators need to provide clarity on the direction of travel, having explicit goals. And that's what we are doing with the European Green Deal in Europe. We have explicit targets, not only when it comes to climate, but we have explicit targets when it comes to environmental objectives. The second, and that's basically the core of my work, is to provide for an enabling framework and to give the stakeholders, and not only necessarily the financial markets only, but also the businesses, the right framework, the right tools. And here, I mean, we are talking about three elements in Europe. The first one is obviously the core, which is taxonomy. I really enjoyed listening to the previous panel. The second element is mandatory disclosure requirements, here imposed not only on the financial sector, but also on the corporates. And also we have some disclosures requirements when it comes to taxonomy. And third, we have, and we are developing a set of tools and different instruments, benchmarks, climate benchmarks, standards, the European Green Bond Standard, that would ultimately allow stakeholders to use those instruments and to translate the taxonomy and the different frameworks into the different products. Now, our journey, I mean, you call it rollercoaster. I mean, yes, it has been bumpy, but I still believe that, you know, it is a journey upwards, and certainly we are making great progress. We are now entering a stage where basically we are starting to implement the different pieces we have been working on over the last 5 years. And we believe that actually, although they have obviously been developed a little bit in silos, they do work and they start bringing the desired benefits. We already see how taxonomy is being taken up and how it is being used, how the businesses and the financial sectors sector participants are preparing for the disclosure requirements. So we see a lot of good progress. Now, what is on our mind, and this is basically an emerging urgency and priority for us, is to support the financial market and support the businesses in the implementation, and making sure that what the stakeholders are expected to do, that they feel support from the policymakers, they feel that there is an understanding for the challenges that they are facing. So we are working now as a matter of priority to facilitate the usability of taxonomy. We are working now to facilitate the usability and the implementation of the whole framework in a coherent way. I mean, we have been talking a lot about transition. So we will show in coming months how the individual pieces and the whole framework works to support transition, how stakeholders can make use of what we have put in place, so that actually they feel that this is a useful toolbox rather than a regulatory burden only. So there is a lot of good positive momentum. I think Dr. Majun said that there is a good momentum for green finance. We do believe that this momentum is still there. Of course, we are trying to set the agenda in the latest context. We understand that there are now challenges that businesses and the financial sector has to face, but we also believe that there is a lot that this green finance agenda can offer to accelerate the journey towards renewables. We have in Europe developed a very ambitious program, Repower, refocus on the renewables, refocus on the energy efficiency, and this is exactly where the green finance and the agenda that we have been developing, can help substantially.
On that point of Repower EU, I mean, today 27 member state heads are meeting to talk about Ukraine, energy, and the challenges we face in Europe. I'm interested to the extent to which the agenda is still very much going strong, because one of the perceptions that we've seen in other parts of the world, and Rathan might want to weigh in on this a little later, is Europe stepping back, Europe starting up coal plants and doing gas and so on. How difficult is this conversation? How much is the momentum still going forward in reality, because the atmospherics are a little bit tricky in the midst of a war and reaction to a war? Give us some insight into this meeting. Gossip, if you can.
Sure, I will not give you a gossip. I will give you a formal line which is perfectly consistent. I mean, I will show that what we are doing on sustainable finance and green finance is perfectly consistent with what we are doing on the Repower. Repower is trying to reduce the dependency on fossil fuels, and especially fossil fuels from Russia. Now, the key focus now is to accelerate the shift towards renewables, and we are having this medium to long-term vision that ultimately the goal has to be met. So we are not compromising on the ultimate objective. We are, of course, aware that there is a very short-term challenge that has to be taken care of by the businesses and by the financial sector as well. So we cannot, and it's unrealistic to expect that everybody will be fully green and will be fully taxonomy compliant as of next year. That would be very wrong to expect. But we also need to understand that there is a very short-term challenge that businesses are facing. But at the same time, we need to be mindful that there is a certain blip now in the system where indeed stakeholders are moving necessarily not as fast as we were expecting. We have, as you know, adopted the so-called complementary delegated act that provided for recognition of some energy sources that we believe are important to support the transition. We do believe that this transition cannot be done from day to another. We do believe that we need to have some interim steps and some recognition for this kind of immediate urgencies. But ultimately, whatever we do now, and I think that that's the key message that I would like to pass across, is that whatever we do now, even when we recognize gas in the green taxonomy under very strict conditions, we are insisting that there has to be a transition towards renewable sources of energy. So there are very strict conditions that ultimately lead to something that we believe would be fully aligned with the targets that we have set. So in our view, there is a very good consistency with what we are doing. Of course, with the Repower, let us be clear, we are trying to reduce dependency on Russian fossil fuels. And the fact that we have recognized a part of the energy sources that maybe might have been seen controversial by some doesn't mean that it has to be coming from Russia. I mean, we are, of course, having a wider perspective here. But the key focus is that ultimately it has to be consistent with the pathways. There can be a blip on the path, but the ultimate goal has to be met.
Thank you. That's very clear. We might come back to you in a minute, Martin. We'll just go around the circle. And also, I will at the end ask for a couple of quick questions. So get ready if you want to have one. Rathin, I'd like to turn to you from a particular perspective. In your current role at ODI, where you are looking essentially at the equitable development of the planet as part of that role, which is a big issue. And of course, your previous roles in India, advising state governments in particular and working with the Prime Minister. What's your perspective on this issue? And most importantly, on the role of governments, both nationally and internationally?
Thank you, Sean, and thank you for inviting me for this conference. It's nice because to be in exile and actually be able to therefore come in person. Well, I'm going to talk about, I don't know what hat that is. It's probably not ODI. The ODI is very supportive. So I'm not going to give you the standard pitch I'd give SIF, right? Nothing I'm going to say to you is what I'm going to say to a donor, for the record, in public, formally. But I'm going to talk to you about the politics surrounding all this. And I'm a bit thrown because I just realized the Prime Minister resigned. So she's not going to be at this meeting, I suppose, tomorrow.
That's Liz Truss, everyone, by the way, the UK Prime Minister.
The UK Prime Minister, yes. Yeah, they resigned a lot here. So the first thing I wanted to say is that I was very sort of empathetic to what Martin was saying just now about the genuine desire, the genuine technocratic desire to make sure that a blip is a blip is a blip. But I have to convey to you, and this seems to be my job all the time, that if you look at it from New Delhi or from Jakarta or from Johannesburg or from Egypt, you begin to grin. Because these were the very countries who said that the imperative, never mind what happens, is to reduce coal. Go away from coal, never mind what happens. And then you see them, for all the best reasons probably, resorting to coal. And I'm told there's a war on. And I say, well, normally in times of war, you choose priorities. The priority clearly here is not climate change, in a blip. I would wonder whether anybody is going to calculate the recent UK energy subsidy and look at the fossil fuel component of that subsidy. It's only pretty large. And you're going to see regress if you calculate that. I was thinking, I have a colleague here, of requesting my colleagues to do it, but that is a fossil fuel subsidy to the extent that it subsidizes energy that comes from fossil fuels. I'm not saying these are good things or bad things, these are normatives. I'm trying to explain to you that the perception, because one, there is no consensus on the war in Ukraine and the rest of the world is not invested in it the same way as perhaps Europe is and the UK is. The second, given that that war in Ukraine is happening, what people are taking away is the priorities that the government sees. And the first priority seems to be, even at the cost of subsidizing fossil fuels, even at the cost of opening up coal plants, protect. Now, it's comforting what Martin says because clearly there's a longer term plan. But this is something I really think at a political level we have to be very conscious of. You will see this happening at the next COP. You will see this happening at the next G20. You will see polite, poker-faced G20 colleagues from emerging economies sitting there and smiling while Germany or France or one of these people yet again lectures us about the need to get out of coal. So that is the first political point I wanted to make. The second political point I wanted to make, and I'm very comforted, I was going to make it far more strongly, but I'm really comforted by some work that Green Bonds is doing, not least because I'm a trustee, and on the taxonomy of resilience. You see, I'm a finance ministry person. And what a finance ministry is interested in is when money is not fungible, is what can this non-fungible money not be spent on? Initially, that was very clear, and somebody said in the previous panel, that you spent it on things that were defined as green. Now we are saying, oh my God, we have to have, then we had something called justice, I think. Justice came in, climate justice. And now we are talking about resilience and transition. So I got very worried because my whole career, I've learned that the more adjectives you have, the less fiscal discipline you have. And these are all adjectives. Resilience, transition. Green, thanks to work of climate bonds and others, had become a noun. And that was very helpful and I'll tell you why in a minute. For ministries of finance, etc., in terms of mobilizing money. However, I'm very comforted. I would urge you to read this note. This is public, right?
It's becoming
got to be.
public in the next 24 hours, which is our resilience overview.
So this is the resilience program of climate bonds, and it says outcome 1. And my only plea to you, Sean, is do these things lexicographically. First outcome 1, then outcome 2. I'm sure you want to. It says investment opportunities that build resilience are identified using science-based standards and definitions. I think if I look at and the reason I think I was getting a bit cross about resilience is when I was reading sort of common literature on the subject, I said, oh my God, now I can buy a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, and that'll be resilience. And if I get solar-powered, like, guns for my police, that's climate resilient. Anything is climate resilient. But this is good because this says science-based and it says systemic and transformative. So I can't piecemeal choose things, right? Then it says, of course, credible resilience measures are financed at scale, etc. But then that's the outcome. In the strategy, which is even better, the first work stream is science-based rule sets. Rule sets mean nouns. And I'm very happy to tell you that there is not a single adjective in the paragraph that follows. Do read it yourself. So this is very encouraging. But this, in my view, flies a bit against the grain that this term resilience is being used very loosely. And what happens, you see, is finance ministries are essentially gatekeepers and also coercive. It is coercive to say you cannot have money for something. Now, if everybody came to you and said this qualifies for something, you would be in trouble. So the good thing about green bonds in today's environment is what finance ministries ask Khasi Karting, certainly ask the poor man who's succeeded him, whose name I forgot, Jeremy Hunt, right? They'll tell you this. It is so important to have fiduciary and prudential breaks on borrowing. Now with vanilla borrowing, that is non-fungible borrowing, there are no breaks because the sovereign is the sovereign. You can do what Khasi Karting did. Oh, let's go and borrow. And let's put the money into fossil fuel subsidies. Energy subsidies for households. But with the green bond, and India just issued a sovereign one, and I'm hoping it will be a better one than Sukuk, which is delightfully vague. The big question in India is, what does this mean in terms of what we cannot spend money on? And can we come up with a timetable saying, every 6 months the money you spent, justify it in terms of its green outcome? That's a finance minister's dream in a time when you're constrained, when you're debted out at this time, when taxes are low. So there's never been a better time, in my view, to let green bonds flower. I was worried with resilience bonds, but if they're going to be science-based, then there's a great opportunity. I want to make one more point and then stop, and then I have 2 more points we can pick up in the discussion. In India, we do something called priority sector lending. I don't like it. I'm an old-fashioned economist in some respects, social democrat on the old-fashioned side. I don't like subsidies, okay? I think they're bad. And I can understand a temporary argument to them, but they must go out. Now, in India, for 70 years, we've been giving lower interest rates to a bunch of stuff. They all sound really nice. Agriculture, housing, poor people stuff, allegedly. And that's much more than Majun's dividend. That's 500 basis points, okay? If you can invent something saying agriculture. Now we have put renewable energy there. You're not going to get much further in this endeavor unless we do some hard work, and maybe resilience will do that. And say, okay, but can we say that in areas like agriculture, in areas like the built environment, in areas like housing, high productivity investments that by definition have to be green, just come to New Delhi or Bombay. Anything you do to build a nice house is going to be more green than what you replace, right? Should that not take a priority over just subsidizing agriculture or subsidizing something else? So that's the second place where governments can actually be persuaded to look at the existing programs and say, at least in emerging economies, we're not trying to reinvent the wheel after having plundered the planet. So we're just starting out. So green means productive, green means equitable, and if that is the case, then green should be the criteria in addition to agriculture or some other thematic story to qualify for a subvention or a subsidy. I think if governments work on these 3 things, European governments on making sure that they remain credible, if they don't want to, it's fine, but I'm just saying. If people understand that the fiduciary attractiveness of green bonds, sustainable bonds has risen exponentially, precisely because a traditional public finance economist like me who doesn't like non-fungible debt is now worried about the volume of debt. And when I look at Khasi Karting, I get even more worried. So, and I'm worried my finance minister will follow on a bad day and somebody else will. So having non-fungible debt is great. And if it's going for a globally good cause, that's even better. And finally, when we look at subsidies, let's look at subsidies at a thematic level, not just things that affect carbon directly. That's been the tragedy of the entire green debate. It's all about energy. Not all about energy, but largely about energy. If we take things like agriculture, the built environment, and talk about smart subsidies there that are by definition green and therefore productive, I think these are three important planks on which we can develop an agenda for governments going forward. And I shall do what I can in the G20 for India, though I don't have high hopes, to make this case. Thank you.
Fantastic. Mary, before I go to you, something Rathin reminded me of is a conversation I had recently with the head of the debt management office in a European country who's considering green bonds. And on that prudential, on the following through, he, at the end of our conversation, after talking about the benefits of green bond issuance, then said, and what I'm going to be able to do is get the other departments to do what they need to be doing around climate change. And I'm thinking, this is the head of a debt management office. They're really sober and straight. They don't do this sort of thing. He was sounding like a Greenpeace activist. Suddenly, he was a 60-year-old bloke in a suit and with a tie on, like the two of us, very sober, and was imagining the power of ensuring that ministries followed through, which he considered a plus. Now, I don't know if everyone thinks that, Murray, but I'm interested in your perspective on this relationship between green thematic issuance and how we perceive what government's doing and how we follow through and track it.
Yeah, thank you. I think what you're both talking about is good governance. Governance is a noun.
Yes.
That's a good word. Yeah? And that's very much part of our analysis. So as rating agencies, sometimes we ask, why do you look at this? Why do you look at climate risks? Well, our answer is that it's part of the solution towards 5 trillion in 2025 is proper assessment of credit risks that come from climate, a proper assessment of these risks in the broader context of credit risk, because climate is not in isolation, but really at the sovereign level, a proper assessment of what governments are doing about it and how, which is really governance. So yes, that is very much part of the analysis that we do. I'll kind of break things down maybe between transition and resilience adaptation, which we haven't spoken too much about today, but that is very important to me in my world when we look at Africa, Asia. The top priority is really resilience adaptation. Starting with transition, from a sovereign credit risk perspective, the main risk is clearly for the hydrocarbon. The country is reliant on hydrocarbon revenues. We're talking about countries in the Gulf, some countries in Africa, some countries in Latin America. Currently derive 40, 50, 70% of their revenue from hydrocarbons. We run simulations in different states of the world, including a net zero scenario. We don't take that as a baseline because we're not seeing enough momentum so far, but we think it is a plausible scenario. And in this world, then Saudi Arabia will see its debt burden increase to 100% of GDP from currently 30%. And Azerbaijan will see its debt burden increase to 200% of GDP, unsustainable by any standards. So we're looking at, in our ratings, we're looking at what are they doing about this. We're seeing some steps, some steps in greening their own economies, but that's not going to be enough for them, given that they're reliant on the rest of the world demand for hydrocarbon. So we're looking at what they're doing to diversify their own source of revenue, and there's some steps. Not enough to survive, not enough to really maintain sustainable debt in a net zero world.
Murray, just to be clear, this is in credit rating analysis, right? This isn't some kind of extra ESG filter. It's the core credit rating.
It's very much.
This is news, everyone. This is really big news, because this is going to change everything. When we start to bring these factors in, it's going to change specifically the cost of borrowing for everyone if they don't take action. Have I got that right?
It's very much part of everyday's credit analysis. At Moody's, every rating analyst has a a framework to think about E, S, and G, including climate.
And to be fair to the others, I know S&P is doing similar sorts of things.
Absolutely.
I think Fitch's is as well,
Absolutely.
not just Moody's. Yeah. But this is an example of the revolution.
And to give an example, in the current context, with oil prices at $90, $100, we're being asked, why don't you upgrade these sovereign ratings? And our answer is because carbon transition is coming at a pace. So if we're not seeing these governments using the windfall gains now to prepare them for the future, where presumably oil prices will not be 90 or 100, then these ratings will be under pressure. So we're not rushing to upgrade them now. So that's having really an impact today.
So let me ask a question. This is very interesting. As you said, this is quite remarkable. So will this be a qualitative assessment or will this be part of your quantitative assessment? If it's the latter, I hope it will come at the expense of the per capita income rate. Then I think everyone will welcome it.
So it's a mix. Like, as you know, our rating analysis is a mix of quantitative and qualitative. I mentioned the quantitative part, that burden's going to X. The qualitative part is what governments are doing about it. So we really, and we think we do need the two. Maybe on staying on transition for the rest of the world, and the majority of the world consumes hydrocarbon, doesn't produce them. The likes of India, of South Africa to some extent, of Brazil, and so on. There, the credit risk is a just transition risk. And Mahjong mentioned that at the end of his remark. It is about ensuring that the country as a whole is moving in a socially stable way towards that transition. I can't say that at this stage we have clear examples of governments really with a clear policy, a plan for the next 5, 10, 20 years on how they're going to get education, skills, competitiveness policies involved. What comforts me is that that's what governments do. They set really incentives to keep their companies competitive in a changing world. They foster education, skills, acquisition in tomorrow's sectors. And we have seen before economies transform in various countries. So there's hope here. We, as rating analysts, we're not yet able to really point to the best in class in that area.
And and I know on the physical risk, you've been bringing in quite a lot of data points to try and address that. Of course, what we now need to do is a bit of a recipe for what to do to ensure you pass the Moody's hurdle and don't get downgraded and maybe even get upgraded. So that's the proactive step. Now, of course, that's what our Climate Bonds Resilience program that we're about to announce that Rathin was talking about. And I think Ujala and Paul are the two key people in the audience. Are you here in the audience? Put your hand up at the back there, stand up, come on. Go and grab her a coffee. She can tell you all about resilience if you want to find out about it. The idea, of course, is to come up with proactive, as Rathin said, science-based, evidence-based programs of resilience activities, physical, economic and social, just transition aspects, which are measures governments can take, which will reduce the risk of default at the end of the day, crudely speaking, going forward. And this is a really important, because remember, we're getting into a world of extreme volatility. We've seen it this last summer. It's the new normal. It's not going to be a blip. And we need to prepare. And governments need to be given some idea of what the preparation steps they might take to choose from that are going to be material and seen as material by the people they're borrowing money from. This is the critical part of the task. Martin, what's happening in Europe in this? And I'm specifically thinking of the Recovery and Resilience Fund, where not only have we got a $250 billion green mandate, which has been used, I want to say, picking up Rathin's point, to push member states to get green stuff together broadly in line with taxonomy. Very powerful tool. This is the beginning of a European borrowing program, folks. This is very important for a range of macroeconomic reasons, but also for the other 500 billion. If I remember correctly, we're requiring resilience to be addressed. Is that right? Have I got that right?
Yes, John, you are right. But of course, the objective was, in the first place, to ensure the economy being back on track and to ensure that the recovery is as green as possible, and certainly not creating the harm that we would like to avoid. With anything that the public sector does. So what I think was quite a revolutionary progress on our side was that I think it was actually the first measure ever in the public sector where Europe basically has introduced the principle of no significant harm for the new money, for the new projects that Europe has made available for member states. And obviously a large chunk of the projects has to comply with these requirements of no harm, which have been, by the way, inspired by some of the concepts in the sustainable finance framework. But I also have to be clear and need to clarify that the public money is not necessarily linked to the technical screening criteria that we have in the Taxonomy Delegated Act, because that would have been, I think, very, very demanding. And I think ultimately, I mean, we have to face the reality. Currently, there is only a very small proportion of exposures and investments and activities aligned with taxonomy. So, you know, if he do that, or if he did that, if he had done that, frankly, there would have been a very little money flowing to member states. So that's why we had to be realistic, pragmatic, and that's why we had, at least as the first stage, introduce this principle of no harm. We have, of course, kind of nudged member states to invest as many projects as possible that would be kind of certainly going in the direction of being sustainable and certainly not, you know, obstructing the green transition, green and digital transition. But obviously now we have to plan the next steps. What I think is important, again, be realistic. Being realistic. I mentioned that currently what we see from the data that, by the way, was mentioned at the last panel from Bloomberg is that there is a small proportion of taxonomy-aligned exposures, investments, projects, and activities. But that's normal. I mean, I know that we are happy about it. We are not happy about it, but it's just reflecting the reality. Now, what I think matters is to give a sense of a direction of travel, and we would expect through the transition plans, the financial sector and the businesses to articulate what it is that they intend to do over time to increase this proportion. So although the proportion is rather small at this current juncture, what we would like to see, and you know, one of the requirements we have for the businesses now is to develop transition plans, is that through these transition plans, stakeholders can also make it public and make it more transparent what it is that they are going to do on their transition journey to improve their environmental performance. And here we are not talking necessarily only about contributing to the environmental goals, but ultimately also reducing the harm. So there is a full flexibility for stakeholders given to disclose what it is that they think should be done. There is nowhere a requirement in our EU law on sustainable finance prescribing to the financial sector what they have to invest and what they have to divest from. We leave this flexibility to the market, but of course, we do hope that there will be a sensible uptake and a credible uptake. I mean, if you see now all these plans how to achieve net zero, it's great that these plans are there. We are very happy about that, but we need to look at to what extent the credibility and the accountability of those plans and commitments actually can be ensured.
Thank you, Martin. I want to take a pause to take 3 questions from the audience. If anyone's got any, there's a mic coming out. I'm going to ask the person on the mic to run because our tempo's got to increase as the day moves on. Any questions or comments you want to drive? This is a very special opportunity you have this very moment. Over there, you've got to run, Rob, run. This is climate change. We've got to move fast.
Thanks, Sean. Shrey Kohli.
Stand up, please. Oh, that's right.
Creaking the knees. Shrey Kohli from the London Stock Exchange. Quick question from the panel. I was interested in your views on sovereign sustainability-linked bond issuance. Obviously, green social sustainability bonds, we've seen a number of sovereigns come out. Sustainability-linked bonds within the sovereign bond market are new. Chile's issued one. Uruguay is in the market today. Do you think, Mr. Roy, it's the kind of fungible funding that finance ministries need with the right incentives in place if they set the right KPIs and benchmarks for themselves? Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to take 2 more questions. Mike, over here, please, but back in the row first. Rob, over here. Run, my friends.
Thank you. So I have a question regarding the taxonomies and innovation and governments leading change. So the first part of the question is, considering the speed of innovation, how often do we review the taxonomies of what is green, what is sustainable? And the second part, particularly for the European Union, is considering back in 2011, I was at the heart of planning for the European Union funds for 2014 to 2020. And at the moment, are plans being made for 2035. Then do those taxonomies that we currently build into our policy making for 2035, how do we make them agile enough to governments to actually be able to lead change? Thank you.
Go. Any other questions? Put your hands up.
Yeah, my name is Alshar. I'm come from Mongolia. I have a question for Marie, and then later a question about emerging market, if you can address this. So I'm actually very impressed with the median age of this audience. Very young professionals, majority. And I guess you don't remember, I actually started my career in investment banking at the time when, last time we heard about a term called bond vigilantes. This was during the Clinton response to the bond investors kind of not agreeing with the loose fiscal policy that the US government wanted to proceed. And now we can see that almost 30 years later, the casualty that we witnessed today, 2 hours ago, which British Prime Minister essentially was a casualty of the bond vigilantes. The response of the market, they were sort of disagreeing with the UK policies. So my question to Marie, I mean, we talk about these trillions of dollars of the very ambitious projects of us going into, I mean, the governments are following different pathways to the low carbon economies. But essential question, do governments actually have money to finance that? I mean, what is the view of the credit rating? And will there be another, like Italy or others, to also be facing this similar problem that the British government just faced in the last several weeks? Now, the question about emerging markets, I saw yesterday a podcast by the FT Moral Money, where it was raising a question that the ESG, even though it should be on the surface very net positive for emerging markets, because it would be a tremendous maybe channel for attracting additional investment, but in reality, it means that because of these extra sort of compliance issues, then the international investors are now perhaps in reality are less inclined to invest in emerging markets. So what is your take, given your experience in India and elsewhere, sure, in terms of how the ESG finance in reality is it conducive for channeling more capital, much needed capital to emerging markets?
Let me just dock off one question, if I may. The Taxonomy Act allows for review every 3 years. That will be a functional platform. So there's a process there. Martin might want to add more, but there's a mechanism already. I'm just conscious of the previous session about taxonomy. I don't want to get Martin to have to go off the topic. But the question about do governments have the money? Whoa, Martin, that's one for you and one for us. And I want to say that listening to Jeffrey Sachs talk a couple of days ago in an African Union event. And he was saying, the world found $7 trillion of stimulus during pandemic. Rich countries did. That's a lot more than what's happening to support emerging markets who are being buffeted by the fact the rich world can raise the money and interest rates are low and there's a sucking sound of money right now into the US dollars because of its reserve currency and so on. There's an extraordinary injustice in the global financial system in terms of our ability to raise money when it affects us in the rich world and our inability to raise money for a few paltry vaccines in the Congo or Tanzania. There's clearly something weird about this idea of can we raise the money? I think that's the case. And of course, we did see in the pandemic in Europe finally agree, after years of stonewalling by some member states, to a 750 billion recovery and resilience fund. Another example of raising the money when we hit the wall. So there's an issue here I think that's worth exploring, given what we have to do globally, and given the inability to raise capital in large sectors of the planet that are highly exposed and at risk of from a resilience perspective. So I'm curious to know our perspective of our speakers. I might start with you, Martin. Look, answer any question you like, Martin, by the way, but if you've got any thoughts and reflections, given you're in Brussels at the moment, and then we'll come to our people in the room.
Oh, thanks, John. Maybe on the public finance, when we presented the new strategy on sustainable finance, in which we have articulated how our thinking about the file has evolved, we had it ready, but then we have focused the strategy only on the private sector, and we thought, well, we cannot just leave it as such, because there will be questions. So what it is that the Commission and the EU budget and of course member states budget are doing here. And in the strategy, you will find a dedicated section in which the Commission committed to further mainstreaming and strengthening the so-called climate and biodiversity mainstreaming in the EU budget. And here we have clearly committed, to basically get inspiration from some of the tools that we have developed for the private sector. So there is a process ongoing where we will update and strengthen the tracking methodologies, which is basically methodologies allowing to check to what extent the money flowing into the projects are green, into the 2021 to 2027 multi-annual financial framework. And of course, there will be a midterm review coming shortly. So there is a lot of effort going on in Europe, in the European Union. And of course, the European Union and the European Commission is supporting member states in their green budgeting efforts individually. We are providing support. We are, of course, investigating the use of green bonds. As you know, the European Commission issued our own green bonds. We are learning from the experience of other member states, and there are many other jurisdictions that have issued green bonds. So there is a process going on. Obviously, how fast this process will go, I cannot commit. That's not in my remit. On the second point, if I may, on the emerging markets, we have been aware that this agenda, in order to have an impact globally, has to provide solutions to those who will face the most significant challenges, and also for investors in Europe and elsewhere who would like to invest in emerging markets. And for that, we are now basically cooking new solutions, new proposals. We have set up a dedicated group, high-level expert group, that should provide recommendations to the Commission what more can be done to support investments in emerging markets, sustainable investments in emerging markets, and how to bridge the transition that these countries are facing, because they are facing the most significant challenges out of all countries.
And Rathin, you'll be pleased to know the Climate Bonds member Zelina is on that expert group. Which one of you'd like to kick off? Comments? I think
I'm happy to take the question about this. Can governments afford this? And I'll go to really when we look at the causes of sovereign defaults, we actually see a relatively weak correlation between the debt burden, the debt to GDP ratio, and default. What causes default is, yes, maybe a high debt burden in some cases, but by and large, a high debt burden at a time when the economy is not growing, at a time when that debt is really expensive, and when governance, again, I'll come back to that, when governance is weak, the institutions are weak to present a credible policy plan to address this. So when we look at government's plans on transition or resilience, we really try to understand, is this going to be money well spent, as I said earlier? Is it going to help buffer the economy against shocks in the future? Is it going potentially to raise the economy's growth potential? Is it going to prevent social risks from really burning up? So we really are agnostic in the first instance when governments announce their plans, but we really look at the details of the plans about how that money is spent to draw an assessment about the credit impact.
Thank you. So let me first address your question about see, no green bond that India has issued in the London market has got undersubscribed. And we have got a modest premium for most of them. And there's plenty of appetite for large emerging economy product, as you well know, since you work in the business, as long as it's not Turkey. Even Brazil, which I would be cautious about, but you guys seem to be fine. Now, if we start bringing in other boutiques, I think the question you've got to ask is how boutique will they stay? See, the most practical thing that's never worked is to issue a GDP bond, where the rate of return on the bond, the coupon, is a function of the GDP, and I've actually recommended you do that. The EU did that, they did a console, where you issue a perpetual You don't pay it back, but your returns are linked to the rate of growth of GDP. Except there's a principal agent problem there. So that, I think, the more diverse you're going to make the kind of boutique assets that you're going to put on the market, sustainability bonds, green bonds, children's heating bonds, the more difficult it is going to be to either get them to scale so they can stay boutique, but when you get them to scale, to avoid the principal agent problem. The question you asked, which is very interesting, is linked to the other question. Wondering how to answer this, I'll have to go into a bit of economics here. Okay, 3 interesting facts. One, John Maynard Keynes said many years ago that if you can do it, you can afford it. He really did. How to pay for the war. And that's true of most large emerging economies, large. In that, if you have a reasonably high level of savings, such that you don't have to take recourse to foreign markets for your sovereigns, if you have capital account controls, and then you have done enough fiduciary, I know people don't like it, but I'm sorry, they're not going away any time after what's happened in the last 4 years. No way. Capital account controls are here to stay in the foreseeable future, in China, in India, and anywhere else that has a brain. Then you can pretty much do what you want. The question is the political choices you make. When it comes to countries that are not in that position, they're going to get indebted. They should be recipients of grants. I mean, why on earth would you lend money to a small island developing state that is being devastated by the climate events now? Obviously, there's a moral obligation there to give them grant money. And there's a very interesting initiative called the Bridgetown Initiative, which actually unpacks this, where it says loss and damage through grants, adaptation through public finance, and mitigation through private finance. I think that's sensible. Because a small island state is not relevant to mitigation.
Yeah.
It is extremely relevant to loss and damage. So we will have to unpack this suite of countries if we are really serious as an international community of putting finance to the service of dealing both with climate change and its impact, and then say, okay, for SIDS, the question is not one of giving them green bonds. The question is one of giving them grants. Equally, countries like India and Brazil should, in my view, and I'm going to try and advocate this, voluntarily recuse from any grant money that's given for loss and damage, saying you need it more than me, and I can go to the markets. So I don't think money is a problem. Let me give you an example. In this country, I was shocked to read, it almost moved me to tears. Children go hungry at school. Okay, the per capita GDP of $35,000, because their parents have to pay if their collective income is 1/3 the per capita income. In India, which is a much poorer country, every child gets a school meal free. The meal may be crap, there may be corruption, blah, blah, blah. But nobody questions the political choice that children will eat free. That political choice is only made in London, the borough of Southwark, where if you're in primary school, you eat free, and the moment you move to secondary, you starve, if you're poor. So these are political choices. We have to be very clear, and this also happens at the international stage and the domestic stage. I've often said with public finance, Keynes is right. You can find the money if you can do it. Can you protect small island states from loss and damage? If you can, the volume of grants, as you were saying, is not large, and we can find collectively a way to resource this. So financing in that sense is not the problem. The choices you make with the financing you require. One technical point, because it's multi-layered again, for your very interesting question. The more we are able to move to a world where we don't think of the Bretton Woods institutions and public financial, multilateral institutions as places where people go to get money to, and this is important resilience bonds, I'll tell you why in a minute, to spend, to develop. This is a very crude idea. Let me give you an example. Resilience bond, education. Government of Mozambique wants to spend on teachers' salaries. You're going to get $1 million from the World Bank. What are you going to do with it? You're going to have to pay people in Mozambique in mita cash, which is the local currency there. So what will you do with those dollars? It's complicated, but economics is complicated sometimes. It's always solvable, then it's simple. Like it's quite Sherlockian that way. You will need to convert it into mita cash. Where's the mita cash going to come from? Will the central bank print it? If the central bank prints mita cash and you put dollars in the bank, what happens to your exports? Your currency will appreciate. What will the central bank then do? It will do something called sterilizing, which is it will sell those dollars. So you might as well have printed the mita cash to pay your teachers' salaries. In short, you cannot use foreign currency. You cannot use foreign currency unless you dollarize to do anything other than buy tradables. You cannot. So so the way out of this, of course, is something I've been advocating for a while. which is domestic currency issuance in global financial markets, with the Bretton Woods institutions using their limited resources to pick up the justifiable exchange risk. I'm hoping with climate and sustainable bonds, that is the way we'll go. So we want to see much more action in Washington and London with a bunch of finance guys trying to minimize the volatility of the exchange risk on sovereign lending. Once you do that, money will not be a problem, and also the autonomy with which countries will be able to spend will not be a problem. Again, with the exception of small island states and really poor countries, those will have to have grants, because by definition, poverty limits your sovereignty. And without sovereignty, you cannot operate in a financial market without a minimum threshold level of sovereignty. I'm sorry that sounds harsh, but that is the reality, and I really wish we would not fool people in places like the Central African Republic and Tuvalu and say, oh, you can come in and act as a sovereign actor the same as India and Turkey. You cannot. Thank you.
Sorry, go ahead.
I'll just pick up on a couple of points there. Yeah, I think at this stage, the grants, we see them coming after the event, after the natural disaster has struck. So yes, small islands, Fiji in 2016, hit by a big cyclone. There was grant money coming in, but after the event. So I think what you're talking about is maybe before the event to build. And yes, the foreign exchange risk is something that you'll be aware of, given your background, very present. Very few emerging markets have managed to tap foreign investors into local currency, not always with great results as well. Recent examples, Ghana, Zambia, so not the large emerging markets. The frontier markets that have tried that have seen very significant capital outflows the moment really risk off came in. And it's not quite clear that because investors are invested in that long-term climate resilience, they'll necessarily stay through the risk on and off type of cycles.
True. That's a very important point.
We've been Martha and I have been talking a long time about sovereign green bond issues out of India, and the sovereign green bond that India will be in rupees. We expect the carve out for international investors. Going to be an interesting test for this program. We need to wrap up, but I'm afraid I've got to ask Martin one last question of you. 15% of procurement, 15% of European GDP is public sector procurement. Isn't that something we could galvanise to drive demand for green taxonomy compliant activities? Is this another way governments could drive the change? Could we do stuff like that? Is there a reason, is that on the agenda at all? Just
John,
imagine.
I wish that I could decide all this myself. What I will do, I will take it back with me, and I will report it to my colleagues who are in charge of the public procurement. I think that this is obviously an area that we are exploring, but on the next steps I cannot comment at this event. But it is indeed, a relevant question. Where else, we should mainstream some of the concepts and ideas that we have been working together on for the last 5-6 years in the public sector area. But again, I have to admit, and that I'm working on financial services. I have already spent my area of focus now to the businesses and to the different policies, and I don't think that I should do even more to the public sector, because I think that I would lose my job very quickly.
I totally
my honest answer.
But it's obvious, and that's going to improve their credit rating, isn't it? Because they're starting to address mitigation, probably resilience, by turning public procurement. The idea, by the way, came from the New Zealand government, who has been looking at the idea of adapting the national taxonomy in development to public procurement guidelines for all New Zealand government purchasing. Yay, New Zealand! Go Kiwis! Anyway, you've heard Martin say this talk. Let's just see where it goes and comes up. We need to finish up. Any last words, Murray, Ruthan? Seeing as I gave Martin last word.
Well, just one thing. We mustn't confuse all these things with sheer incompetence of governments, as we know in this country. So governments are very often incompetent, and incompetence will be punished by the markets, and there's nothing wrong with that. But, that's not all markets punish people for, but we have a lot of incompetence going around nowadays, not least in anyway.
Maybe from me, I've heard a lot in the rest of the day. Private sector waiting for clear frameworks, clear regulation. I don't think frameworks and regulation comes clear in version 1.0. So I think there's a bit of iteration there to expect, but I think there can be a feedback loop, a healthy feedback loop between what markets need and what governments can provide.
Indeed, Sean, I don't want to have the last word.
Go ahead.
I still would like to comment on what Mari said. Indeed, we are planning this feedback loop, so we are indeed preparing Again, a lot of support to the stakeholders how to implement what we have put in place, but we also expect action, and that actually will be my last message to the audience. I talked in the beginning about that what we have done as public sector and policymakers, but now we expect actually the private sector, the financial sector, and the businesses actually to take and to make use of these tools and of these frameworks. Of course, we are open to hear what doesn't work, but we also would like to hear what works. And we would like to see that, that there is a difference, there is an impact. So we are in the hands of the private sector. So don't expect that this change will come only from Brussels. Thank you.
In 1992, in Clinton's re-election campaign for US presidency, there was a video made, a movie called The War Room, which is what you were referring to earlier. And in that War Room documentary, which is a great documentary, by the way, James Carville, Clinton's campaign director, says, after being buffeted by the headwinds of the bond market during the campaign, when I die, I want to come back as the bond market, because then everyone's terrified of me and they all do what I want them to do. Well, that's what we're trying to do at Climate Bonds, everyone. You got the clue. That's the secret. It's out there. Thank you very much for joining us. Please say thank you to our panelists. Coffee break now. Reconvene in a little while.